How's it going? My name is Jess and this is Reasoned. Today I'm joined by Dr. Jake Scott, who is chairman of the Mallard, and we will be discussing whether free speech is under threat at universities. So Jake, do you think free speech is under threat at universities, and how has this come about? Is it student enforced or is it teacher enforced?
I'm actually a little bit different on this topic than most conservatives or people on the right. I don't necessarily think there's a crisis of free speech at university. That's usually sort of met with some skepticism from people on the right. And broadly speaking, I think that's because right-wing opinions are not fashionable at university. There's definitely an element in fields of politics and political fields to not teach more right-wing thought than teach left-wing thought. So, for example, when I was studying political theory as an undergraduate, we were definitely more concerned with liberal and left liberal theorists than right liberal theorists. Even theorists that the right can lay claim to, such as John Locke, Thomas Hobbes, John Stuart Mill, even though I don't consider them to be conservatives, and contemporary thinkers, so those responding to 20th century problems and 21st century problems, such as, say, Ludwig von Mises or Murray Rothbard or Friedrich Hayek, they tend to be treated with enormous skepticism. And political projects of the right, such as Thatcherism or conservatism and so on, they're almost treated with outright disdain. And there is more of an emphasis placed on the negatives of right-wing projects than there are on left-wing projects. But I don't think the problem is free speech, or at least from an institutional perspective. And I know that the Free Speech Union and others make reasonable points on this topic, that free speech is not encouraged as much as it probably could be. But there's a slightly different point there. This is not necessarily about encouragement. The problem is declining standards. And the reason this matters is universities have pivoted from being institutions of knowledge to institutions of education, which again might sound odd because our typical idea of university now is of students, large numbers of students being taught by specialist educators. But the actual reason that universities were established in the first place was to preserve knowledge. They were seen as the guardians of inherited knowledge that should be preserved, refined, and improved and passed on to the next generation. And that next generation would be students, but they would not be students in the contemporary understanding of students. Rather, they would be people who would be training to become academics themselves. In many places, most universities, especially in Britain, were originally set up to assist people becoming lawyers, or politicians, or the clergy. Because of people like Tony Blair and this desire to have 50% of the population go to university, or more, as the Tony Blair Institute wants to argue, we now have a situation where universities compete, like private schools, to attract university students or potential university students, to the point where grades are reduced or places are guaranteed with no real proof of academic skill. In many places, this is even further supplemented with quotas or diversity requirements. So now we have a situation where the purpose of universities is actually not the preservation of knowledge, but education on one hand and marketization on the other. So why does this matter for free speech? Well, once you start to have a declining standards of students, you start to see students, when they're confronted with alternative views, have the inability to respond to them. Either in terms of content, they either don't understand the theories that they're faced with or the opinions that are being presented to them, or, frankly, the intellectual maturity to take alternative views as just that, alternative views. Instead, you start to see students take alternative ideas and alternative suggestions personally. You start to see it as a threat, as a challenge. Students more and more arrive at university with very set ideas, and they treat essays as an exercise in justifying their ideas, rather than as an opportunity to challenge those ideas and engage with other ideas. So the problem with free speech at university is not an institutional failing in regards to protecting people's right to talk. What matters is the inability of students to treat speech as just that, speech. Instead, they see it as something that is harmful, or as something that they can't deal with, or something that they don't understand, and they lash out. That's where universities are failing. We're making it far too easy for people to go to university. And when they're here, we don't challenge them enough. So actually the problem isn't really the institutions. The problem is the students. And we see this more and more with students policing the language of lecturers. Not just each other, but the language of lecturers. Egregious examples of students who consider themselves to be transsexuals or non-binary or whatever the term is, tell their teacher that they are being offensive if they use that student's legal name. And of course, students tend to be far too young to have changed their name. So when students are again presented with, not even this time alternative viewpoints, but just alternative ways of thinking, because they're so wrapped up in the beliefs that they have, that then they start to lash out. And I think there's a real problem now, and the Spectator was publishing about this a few years ago, so this isn't necessarily new, but this is something that's increasingly a problem. That students are the source of this censorious attitude, and not educators, not university teachers. There's very often students in my class who are clearly wanting to say something perhaps a little bit more right wing or a little bit less left wing, and I'm more than happy to encourage that. And where I think that students perhaps need to be exposed to alternative views, I present those alternative views. I always make sure when I'm teaching to not give my view, but to give alternative views to what they're hearing. Unfortunately, the alternative views to what they're hearing tend to be right-wing views.
So how have we gotten into this situation where students are afraid to speak, whether that's simply saying there's only two genders, for example?
We'll take a stab at an answering it. As I say, the declining standards means we have increasingly less stringent requirements of access for university, and we end up with students who are less able to deal with ideas. And I think it's frequently presented as gospel what's taught in university, rather than theoretical knowledge, especially what I teach. I teach in political science and political theory, and certain things are taught as gospel, and the alternative viewpoints are not, again, presented with equal standing. A lot of very, very philosophical questions are not dealt with in depth, and are instead taken as serious, or at least taking quite philosophically incoherent ideas as serious. So, for instance, in one of the modules I teach on, we had a week on queer theory, which sort of indicates that, what we're talking about here. And one of the sort of dismissed comments towards the end of the lecture was that, well, some philosophical rebukes to queer theory is that by trying to break out of a binary distinction of identities, you're actually still creating a binary, but the binary is simply between those who are queer and those who aren't. So even non-binary people are caught in a binary between those who are non-binary and those who aren't. So, but the way they sort of talked about this criticism was to say, oh, this is just a little bit pretentious. Well, no, actually, this goes to the heart of the issue, because if the philosophical grounds of claims do not hold up, then we shouldn't be teaching them. And I remember when critical race theory started to really emerge into the public domain, it was about 2 years after I was taught as an undergrad that critical race theory is a Marxist interpretation of racial justice theory. So then, when I would say to people, oh, well, critical race theory is just a Marxist interpretation of racial issues, people would say, oh, you can't say that. That's conspiracy theory. So, no, that's what I was taught. And I was taught that by people who knew what they were talking about. Because, again, this is, these people are clever. University lecturers are clever. There's no denying that. It's just that whether the ideas are too clever is something that we need to consider. So, like I say, I think students aren't taught how to think as much as they're taught what to think. And universities should be about teaching you how to think rather than what to think. And certain ideas are treated as truthful rather than as theoretical. And when it comes to issues like, saying that there are two genders, well, I think, to be perfectly frank, I think a lot of the reason people are, I think there's two reasons. I think there's two reasons why people are not prepared to stand up and push back against the censors. First is politeness. I think the vast majority of people are just a bit too polite to say that's insane. I think the other point is that a lot of people are not taught the rebukes or the alternative views or the alternative facts, or frankly speaking, the real facts. So when people say, there's more than two genders, a lot of people are either educated into thinking that's true, or they're educated out of trying to resist it. So again, the free speech issue at universities isn't necessarily there. It's more the fact that certain viewpoints are taught as if they're truthful when in reality they're just theoretical, and the alternative viewpoints are not taught. But in terms of why or how we got to this point, I don't know, because it's definitely changed. When I was a student, which wasn't that long ago, believe it or not, things were not like this. They were going this way, but they weren't like this. And they weren't as bad as it feels, or at least as bad as it felt. I do think there's actually been a little bit of an improvement lately of students being more prepared to listen to wider viewpoints. But I say that those are usually viewpoints of the left, and they're not prepared to listen to viewpoints of the right. Why, I don't know. I think the Conservative Party has a lot to answer for in that regard. But yeah, I say there's been an improvement. There has been an improvement in the willingness to listen to alternative, or at least consider alternative viewpoints, but the overall decline in ability is still noticeable.
Interesting. So what do you think the solution is? Do you think the state can solve this issue, or do you think it needs to be more on a cultural or social level?
So in terms of what the solution is, I'm not someone on the right who's scared of government action. I think the government has to do things about this. And people might think that makes me as bad as the socialists, but frankly, I'd rather we had right-wing censorship than left-wing censorship, because the censorship is going to come, and I'd rather it was from our side. And one thing I think is quite simple: defund the lowest performing third of universities. That's the first thing. Cut out the chaff. There's absolutely no justification. Especially when we've marketized universities. People like to think the market takes care of itself, but in reality, so many businesses and so many institutions are propped up by government money that we might as well start using that muscle. And so that's the first thing. Defund the lowest performing third, maybe even half of universities. The second thing I thought was quite interesting was if you look to America, certain states such as Florida and Texas are again using their sorts of government muscle, not just to defund universities, but to start auditing what's being taught, and not auditing what's being taught in the sense of promoting certain opinions and viewpoints, but certainly preventing the teaching of those viewpoints that are not true. For instance, we should be absolutely prepared on the right to call out critical race theory as a conspiracy theory. Kemi Badenoch was fully prepared to say this in the Commons, and given that the Sewell report proved that systemic racism basically doesn't exist in Britain, then that should stop being taught, because at that point it's agitation, it's not education. We should be prepared to call this out and say, no, this isn't true. Don't know why you're teaching this. Teach it as a viewpoint if you like, but don't treat it as truth. And that's why I say, Florida has been very good about this. In America, there are important differences. You have the parent-teacher association, so you can have a certain degree of democratic control over what's being taught. But here, because of the state of education here, we need to be a little bit more straightforward and audit what's being taught, as well as making sure that we tread the line well. Making sure that we don't do what was suggested by Rishi Sunak, which is pro-British stuff. I mean, definitely we should be teaching pro-British stuff, but not only teaching pro-British stuff. But definitely we should be prepared to stop universities teaching falsehood and start, But the other thing as well, part of the solution is we have to go back to an elitist university system. And that might sound like something people don't want to hear, but we need to start again allowing for people to enter based purely on merit. There's probably a lot of people in universities who wouldn't get in. I imagine I probably wouldn't get in. But that's perfectly fine. That universities should be for the intelligent, and they shouldn't be for everyone, because most people aren't intelligent. And again, people don't like to hear that, but it's the God's honest truth. So part of the solution for this is, again, trimming down the number of universities, but also preventing universities from taking on more students than they can handle. I think there's a fairly easy first step there, and that is preventing universities from taking in more students than they can physically include in a single space. For example, at the University of Birmingham, where I teach, there are roughly 350 students on politics. There is no room in the university that's big enough for that. And the sort of consequence of this, the sort of cycle of this, is that you end up with universities kind of metastasizing, spreading out constantly across geographic locations, until eventually they've bulldozed everywhere around them and they've turned everything into university buildings. But eventually that bubble's going to burst. And I'd rather that we burst it ourselves and controlled that explosion rather than letting it get to a really, really bad state of affairs. So, yeah, I think those would be my three solutions. One, force universities to only accept students that they can actually, physically have in one location. Second, defund the lowest performing third of universities, actually start getting rid of universities, stop this weird proliferation of universities we've got. And third, use the muscle of the state to stop people teaching falsehoods. I hope that's, if not necessarily agreeable to the viewers, but at least interesting.
Thank you so much, Jake, for joining me on this video, and thank you so much for watching it. Make sure to like, comment and subscribe. That would help out so much. I've been Jess Gill and this is Reasoned. Thank you so much for watching. Goodbye.